Tanya Bell walked into the courtroom with a calm demeanor and a steady stride, her eyes briefly scanning the room as she entered the familiar space, the smell of old wood and worn furniture filling the air. She had been here before, but never for something like this. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she took her seat at the back of the room, trying to blend in like everyone else. Today was just another day. In the seemingly ordinary world she found herself navigating after returning from a mission that took her far beyond this Earth to the International Space Station. The very thought of her journey felt surreal. She had spent months orbiting in space, and now she was sitting in a courtroom over a minor traffic violation. Tanya didn't mind the simplicity of it. All she knew that sometimes life had a way of grounding even the most extraordinary individuals. She had long accepted the reality that her accomplishments often went unnoticed by those around her. At least in situations like this here in the courtroom, it was unlikely that anyone would recognize her as the astronaut who had contributed to groundbreaking scientific research from space. She was just another person facing the consequences of a speeding ticket like so many others who came through the same doors each day. As she sat quietly waiting for the proceedings to begin, her mind wandered back to the day of her launch. She remembered the excitement mixed with nerves as she suited up for her journey into space, the feeling of weightlessness as she floated in the spacecraft, and the overwhelming awe she felt when looking out the window at Earth. Below, she had represented not only her country, but her community as a Black woman in a field where people like her were often underrepresented. But that was a story for another time. Today, she was here to take care of what needed to be done and move on. The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of activity, a few people quietly chatting, some flipping through papers, others waiting for their names to be called. The judge, an elderly man with a serious air of authority, glanced over his docket as he prepared to begin the session. He didn't pay much attention to the people in the room until their names were read aloud. It was just another day for him, nothing special or extraordinary about this routine, but as Tanya sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that the day would soon take an unexpected turn. The clerk called out the first name on a list, and the room fell into a hushed silence. As the proceedings got underway, Tanya shifted in her seat, feeling the eyes of those around her settling on her. For the briefest moment, she was used to it, the subtle glances, the quick judgments people made when they saw her, but she didn't let it bother her. She had learned long ago that these moments were fleeting, just like the courtroom itself. It would soon be over, and she would go back to her life. As the judge made his way through the docket, his voice echoed in the room, formal and deliberate, each name being read with precision and authority. When Tanya's name was called, it sounded like the beginning of another typical session to her. She stood up to make her way to the front, her heart beating a little faster now, not because of the nerves, but because of the oddity of it all. She had traveled to the edge of space, and here she was standing before a judge over something as small as a speeding ticket. But as she walked to the front, Tanya couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. A woman who had touched the stars was about to receive a fine for a traffic infraction, yet she had always believed in fairness and accountability, no matter how small the issue was, no matter how ordinary the moment seemed. As Tanya approached the bench, she could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. The whispers that followed her as she walked to the front were faint but noticeable. They didn't bother her, but there was something about the way people looked at her. It wasn't with curiosity or admiration. It was with that same glance people often gave when they saw someone they thought they understood, someone they thought they had figured out. But Tanya knew better than to take those looks personally. The truth was, no one really knew who she was, not truly. The judge looked up from his papers as she reached the stand, his eyes scanning her briefly before he cleared his throat and began to speak. Ms. Bell, he began, his voice firm, but lacking the warmth of recognition. I see you've been cited for speeding. You understand how serious this is, don't you? Tanya nodded quietly as she waited for him to continue. She had been through these moments so many times before, and despite her remarkable career, she was just another person here now, facing the same fate as anyone else who had broken the law. The judge didn't seem to notice the way Tanya held herself with quiet grace, or how she seemed almost too poised for someone with a speeding ticket. He continued on with his lecture about the importance of following traffic laws and the consequences of reckless driving. Tanya listened attentively, but her mind wasn't entirely present. Her thoughts drifted to the countless hours she'd spent training in space, the many obstacles she overcome to get there, the way she had worked harder than anyone else to prove that women of color belonged in fields like science and technology. But in this room, none of that mattered today. She wasn't an astronaut. She was just another person in a courtroom trying to get through the process. She could feel the weight of the judge's gaze, though it wasn't judgmental. It was simply that of someone who saw her as another person, caught up in a system that had no regard for who she was beyond the basic labels and categories the world had placed on her. But she wasn't angry. She didn't resent the situation. It was just the way it was in moments like these. Tanya had learned to accept the simplicity of the system she was part of. She was a black woman facing the same consequences anyone else would face, and that was fine. She had always been prepared to take whatever came her way. The judge continued speaking, but Tanya's focus was now solely on his words. She could hear the familiar pattern, the rhythm of authority in his voice, the way he repeated himself to emphasize the seriousness of the matter. She had heard this 100 times before from various judges across the country. It was always the saying, the rules were the rules, no exceptions for who you were or where you came from. Tanya had seen this in every courtroom she had ever entered. She had heard the same speeches from lawyers and judges alike, who assumed she was just another person looking to get away with something she knew better than to fight it. The judge finished speaking and looked at her expectantly, waiting for a response. Tanya cleared her throat and looked him in the eyes for the first time, fully aware of the discrepancy between the life she had lived and the one being assumed in this room. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I accept the consequences of my actions. But if I may, I'd also like to say that everyone has a story that shapes the decisions they make, and perhaps that story should be remembered before the rules are enforced." The judge raised an eyebrow, his expression slightly puzzled, but he nodded as if acknowledging her statement, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant by it. Tanya didn't elaborate further. She didn't feel the need to. She knew the importance of being composed in these situations, and despite everything she had been through, she remained grounded in the moment, even if no one knew the story that made her who she was. As Tanya stood quietly in front of the judge, she could sense the subtle shift in the air, the brief pause as the judge looked down at his papers, almost as if he had forgotten what he was saying. For a moment, he adjusted his glasses, and then his gaze flickered back up to her. But this time, there was something different in his eyes, something that made Tanya's heart skip a beat. It wasn't judgment or even curiosity. It was something more akin to realization. His brow furrowed slightly as he glanced between the paperwork in front of him and the woman standing before him, as if trying to place her in a context that suddenly felt out of place. The silence in the room grew thicker. Tanya stood there calmly waiting for him to continue, though she wasn't sure what was happening. She could feel the room's attention subtly shift toward her as people in the courtroom began to whisper, not loud enough to be disruptive, but enough to make her realize that something was about to happen, something unexpected. She remained still, focused on the judge, and then she saw the court clerk, Maria, who had been quietly filing papers at her desk, suddenly looked up, her eyes widening, as if she had seen a ghost. Her mouth opened slightly, and she quickly typed something into her phone, her fingers moving at a speed that suggested urgency. Tanya wasn't sure if she should be alarmed or amused, but she remained composed as the judge continued to stare at her, his confusion apparent. Maria stood up from her desk, almost as if she were trying to decide whether to speak or remain silent. The court fell into an even deeper hush as the atmosphere shifted from routine to something much more charged. Maria hesitated for a moment before leaning toward the judge and whispering something into his ear. Tanya could see the way the judge's posture stiffened as he listened to whatever it was Maria had just said. The surprise in his face was unmistakable. For the briefest moment, Tanya saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and she knew right away that he had finally figured it out. But the question was, how long would it take him to process what he had just been told, and what would come next? The judge didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there looking at the papers in front of him and then back at Tanya, as if he were trying to place her within the framework of his own understanding of the world. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the woman standing in front of him wasn't just anyone. She wasn't just a random defendant. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, the judge looked up at Tanya, and his voice broke the stillness. "Your name?" "Tanya Bell." He began slowly, his words more deliberate now. Then before I believe you're the astronaut who just returned from the International Space Station, the one who's been part of the groundbreaking research on the mission this entire time, Tanya didn't respond immediately, but she felt a shift inside her. Her chest tightened just slightly as she realized what was happening, how the ordinary situation was now suddenly charged with something much greater, something bigger than just her ticket. The courtroom was still. The whispers had stopped, and for the first time since she'd entered, Tanya felt the weight of everyone's gaze on her. No longer was she just a woman dealing with a routine traffic infraction. She was Tanya Bell, the astronaut who had been to space. Tanya paused for a moment, her mind racing, but her expression remained calm. She had anticipated moments like this, moments when people discovered who she was, moments when her identity as an astronaut became more than just a title. She had always wondered how people would react when they realized her accomplishments. But this, in a courtroom, over a speeding ticket of all things, was unexpected. She had never imagined this particular revelation would happen like this. The judge's words hung in the air, drawing everyone's attention to the fact that they were now looking at someone who had literally touched the stars. For a split second, Tanya felt her face flush under the weight of it all. She didn't want the attention, not here. Not in this setting. She had come to the courthouse to handle something simple, and now, in a strange twist of fate, she was at the center of a moment that felt entirely out of place. "Yes, Your Honor," Tanya said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm the same Tanya Bell. I had just returned from the International Space Station. But this," she gestured to the proceedings, "this is something different. I'm just here to take care of this issue." The judge blinked, still processing the information. I had no idea. He paused and let out a sigh, clearly taken aback. "I apologize for my earlier comments. I had no idea who you were." Tanya offered him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Your Honor. I understand. I'm just like anyone else. I'm here because of a ticket. That's it." The room, which had once been filled with soft murmurs, now fell completely silent. The judge looked around at the people in the courtroom, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had clearly underestimated the person standing in front of him. He cleared his throat, adjusting the glasses perched on his nose as he gathered his thoughts. I don't know how to proceed here," the judge said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "On one hand, you've done something incredible for all of humanity, something most of us can only dream of. But on the other hand, the law is the law. We can't just let things go without consequences." Tanya nodded, fully aware of the delicate situation. She had expected to be treated fairly, as anyone would be, but she understood the complexity of the moment. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Your Honor. I know the law, and I know that actions have consequences. I don't expect to be treated any differently just because I've gone to space." The judge seemed to relax slightly, his gaze softening. "I suppose I didn't realize how much pressure you must be under, how much responsibility you carry. You're not just an astronaut. You represent a generation of people who've never been represented in the field of space exploration before." Tanya's heart gave a small flutter at his words, but she didn't let it show. She knew what he meant. She had spent years breaking barriers, proving that someone like her could not only dream of reaching the stars but actually do it. She had never let herself be defined by anyone's expectations, and she wasn't about to start now. "Thank you, Your Honor, but at the end of the day, I'm just a person like anyone else. We all have our mistakes, and we all have to answer for them." The judge nodded, looking back down at the papers in front of him. He seemed torn, unsure of how to balance his reverence for her accomplishments with the need for fairness in the courtroom. The moment stretched on, the room filled with an expectant silence. After a long pause, the judge finally looked up at Tanya. "I think I can speak for everyone here when I say that we're all incredibly proud of what you've done. You've shown the world what's possible." But he hesitated for a moment before continuing. "The law applies to all of us, and it's my responsibility to ensure that we're all held accountable." Tanya could see where he was coming from, and she appreciated his honesty. But she also knew that there was more to the story than just a fine or a ticket. This was bigger than that. She had fought for years to make her dreams a reality, and it wasn't just about the rewards. It was about paving the way for others to do the same. "I understand," Your Honor, Tanya said, her voice calm yet firm, and I accept whatever consequences you decide. But I hope you'll also understand that none of us are defined by one moment, one mistake, or even one choice. The judge paused, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not just as an astronaut, but as a person who had lived a life filled with hard work, sacrifices, and perseverance. Finally, he nodded slowly, his expression softening. You're right, he said, his voice thoughtful, and I'll take that into account. The judge sat back in his chair, clearly weighing his options. Tanya stood quietly before him, calm and composed, but inside, she was keenly aware of the tension that had suddenly filled the room. People were still watching her, but the air had shifted from one of judgment to something more akin to respect. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she didn't let it distract her. This wasn't about them. It was about doing what she needed to do to resolve the situation and move forward. The judge glanced at the court clerk, Maria, who seemed to be in a daze, still processing the information about Tanya's identity. Maria wasn't the only one who seemed caught off guard. The other people in the room, those who had been quietly observing the proceedings, were now whispering to one another, exchanging looks, their murmurs filled with disbelief and curiosity. It wasn't every day that an astronaut found themselves in a courtroom for something as mundane as a speeding ticket. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat and spoke. Ms. Bell, I believe we had a bit of an unexpected turn here today, and I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be. He paused and gave her a thoughtful look. I understand that you're an accomplished individual, someone who's contributed greatly to our understanding of space. I'd also understand that the law is the law, and I have a responsibility to uphold it. But at the same time, I'm also aware that life is rarely as simple as black and white. Tanya nodded, relieved that he was considering the broader picture. She had always known that life, especially her life, was complicated. It wasn't just about the job she did or the title she held. It was about the choices she made and the consequences those choices carried. But it was also about understanding that sometimes context mattered. I appreciate your understanding, Your Honor, Tanya said, her voice steady but warm. I'm just here to resolve this and move on. I'm not looking for special treatment, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm above the law. I've made my mistake, and I'll take responsibility for it. The judge nodded, seemingly reassured by her words, but there was still a hesitation in his expression, as if he was unsure how to proceed. He shuffled through his papers again, scanning them quickly. Tanya could see that he was trying to figure out what would be the fairest way to handle the situation. You're right, he said finally, breaking the silence. You're like anyone else who comes through this courtroom. The law doesn't change because of who you are or what you've done, and I'll make sure to apply the same standards to your case as I would anyone else's. He took a deep breath. However, given the unique circumstances, I'm willing to offer you a slight reduction in the fine. You've earned it, in my opinion. Tanya's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, though she didn't show much emotion. She had expected the fine to remain the same, as she wasn't asking for any leniency. But the judge's offer was a recognition of the larger context of who she was and what she had accomplished. She didn't take it for granted. Thank you, Your Honor, she said with a nod. But I'd like to make one thing clear. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm not above the law, and I wouldn't want anyone to think that this is about anything other than me taking responsibility for my actions. The judge seemed to appreciate her perspective, and for a moment, Tanya saw a glimmer of respect in his eyes. You're right, and I believe you, he said, his voice steady now, the earlier uncertainty replaced with a sense of resolve. This is about fairness, and it's also about recognizing the humanity in each person who walks through these doors. He looked down at the fine, tapping his pen against the paper as he considered the final amount. I'm going to reduce your fine by 50%. I think that's fair. You've done great things for humanity, and I'm not going to let a momentary mistake overshadow that. Tanya smiled softly, grateful for the judge's fairness and understanding. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, and she appreciated that he saw the bigger picture. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice sincere. I accept the fine, and I'll make sure to pay it, just like anyone else. The judge nodded. Court is adjourned then. Ms. Bell, you may return to your life now, and I wish you all the best with your future endeavors. As Tanya turned to leave the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of resolution wash over her. She had come in expecting nothing more than to handle a simple infraction, but in the end, it was a reminder of how far she had come, not just in her career, but in understanding that everyone, no matter their accomplishments, must face the consequences of their actions. And that was something she could live with. As Tanya exited the courtroom, the weight of the situation seemed to lift, though the echoes of the day's events lingered in her mind. It was almost surreal how quickly the routine of everyday life could collide with the extraordinary, and how one moment could forever shift the way people saw you. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt the familiar rush of relief that came with putting something behind her, though this was unlike any other legal matter she'd ever encountered. In the quiet of the courthouse halls, she could still hear the murmurs of the people who had watched her leave. It was strange, being noticed for something that had nothing to do with her accomplishments, yet everything to do with her identity. She had expected the usual rush of headlines, interviews, and public interest when she returned from her mission in space. It had all come and gone quickly, swallowed by the constant cycle of news. But today, it had been different. She hadn't just been Tanya Bell, astronaut. She had been a woman caught in the humdrum of normalcy, reminded that no matter how far you travel, there are always systems that don't recognize who you are. And there would always be moments when the world would treat you like just another person, just another statistic. Tanya stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, the harsh sunlight stinging her eyes. It felt good to breathe in the fresh air, to feel the wind against her skin. She hadn't realized how much she missed the simple things. Being back on Earth had a way of grounding her in ways that space never could. There, she had lived a life of precision, of scientific purpose, of weightless tranquility. Here, she was just another person walking down the street, dealing with the mundane details of everyday existence. And that was all right, too. As she walked toward her car, Tanya couldn't help but reflect on the way people saw her. In the courtroom, she had been just another defendant, albeit one with an exceptional background. The judge had respected her accomplishments, but ultimately, he had treated her like anyone else. In some ways, that felt like a victory. In a world that often placed people on pedestals, it was humbling to be reminded that her worth wasn't defined by titles or accolades. She was Tanya Bell, yes, but she was also just a person. And that, in its own way, was a freedom she had grown to appreciate over time. When Tanya reached her car, she took a moment to pause and look around. The world outside the courthouse was busy, people rushing to and from their destinations, lost in their own lives. She saw a group of kids laughing and playing outside a nearby cafe, their carefree energy reminding her of how different her life had become. She had never had the luxury of being able to let go in the same way. Her life had always been about focus, about discipline, about pushing herself to the limits. But today had reminded her of something important, that the little moments mattered too. The simple moments, the everyday moments. And while she would never trade her time and space for anything, she also knew that life had to be lived on Earth as well. Just as she was about to get in her car, Tanya's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her old mission commander, Sam. The message was simple, but it made her smile. Mission accomplished, Belle. Now go and enjoy some Earth time. You've earned it. Tanya typed back a quick response. Thanks, Sam. I'm working on it. She put the phone down and got into her car, feeling lighter than she had all day. The drive back to her apartment was quiet, the familiar streets reminding her of how far she had come. In that moment, Tanya felt a deep sense of peace. She had handled the ticket, dealt with the judge's unexpected recognition, and walked away with grace. But more than that, she had learned something new today. It wasn't the extraordinary moments that defined her. It was the quiet ones, the moments when she wasn't out saving the world or orbiting in space. It was the little, everyday decisions that made her who she was. And maybe that was the greatest discovery of all. As the days passed, the buzz surrounding Tanya's courtroom appearance slowly faded from public attention. The world moved on to the next story, the next headline, as it always did. But for Tanya, the experience lingered. It had been a reminder of the complexities of identity, of how easily it could shift depending on the circumstances. She wasn't just the astronaut, the woman who had spent months in space, breaking records and pushing the limits of human exploration. She was also someone who had made a simple mistake, a speeding ticket that brought her face to face with the ordinary, with the everyday rules that governed the world she lived in. Tanya spent the next few weeks back at work, doing what she did best, focusing on her mission, her research, and her team. But her thoughts kept drifting back to that day in court, to the judge's words and the unexpected recognition she had received. It had been a surreal moment, but it had also taught her something important, that she was more than the sum of her achievements. She wasn't just defined by the missions she completed or the places she'd been. She was defined by her choices, by how she showed up in the world, both on the grand stage of space and in the smaller, quieter moments that made up her day-to-day life. One afternoon, as Tanya sat in her office reviewing mission reports, she received an unexpected visitor. Her old colleague and friend, Dr. Emily Hayes, walked in with a smile on her face. Emily had been one of the first people to offer her congratulations after her return from the space station, and the two had kept in touch ever since. Tanya looked up from her desk, her face lighting up when she saw her friend. Well, if it isn't Dr. Hayes herself," Tanya said, standing up to greet her. "What brings you to this neck of the woods?" Emily chuckled, taking a seat across from Tanya. "I heard about your little courthouse adventure," she said with a grin. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to hear that you were out here getting a speeding ticket. You, of all people." Tanya laughed, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, well, I guess even astronauts can make mistakes," she said with a shrug. "It wasn't exactly how I thought my day would go, but I learned a few things." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? What's that?" Tanya paused for a moment, considering how to explain it. "It made me realize that I've spent so much time focusing on the big picture, on the missions and the spacewalks, that I forgot about the little moments. The moments that defined who I am, outside of all the titles and accomplishments." Emily looked thoughtful, nodding slowly. "I get that. It's easy to get caught up in the extraordinary things, but you're right. It's the small, everyday things that make us who we are. It's the way we treat people, how we show up for the people around us, and how we handle the challenges life throws at us." Tanya smiled, appreciating her friend's perspective. "Exactly. I used to think that the big moments defined me, but I think I've come to realize that it's the quiet moments, the decisions I make in between the big events that really matter." Emily leaned forward, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "That's a powerful realization, and I think it's something you can share with the world. Maybe not everyone gets to be an astronaut, but they can all learn from how you handle life's challenges." Tanya's smile widened, a sense of clarity washing over her. She had always known that her work as an astronaut was important, but she hadn't fully understood until now how much her ability to navigate life's everyday hurdles mattered too. Her life wasn't just about being the first to walk in space or pioneering new frontiers. It was about living with purpose, regardless of the situation. Whether it was in the quiet solitude of space or the humdrum of everyday life, it was her integrity and her ability to stay true to herself that made her who she was. "Maybe I'll write a book one day," Tanya joked, her eyes sparkling with humor. "The Astronaut's Guide to Everyday Living." Emily laughed. "I'd buy it," she said with a wink. "But seriously, Tanya, I think the way you approach life, both the big and small things, will inspire a lot of people, and that's something special." Tanya felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had come to realize that her story, her journey, was more than just about space. It was about finding balance, embracing both the extraordinary and the ordinary, and recognizing that every moment, no matter how small, was an opportunity to make a difference. As they chatted more about life, work, and the future, Tanya couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't need to be in space to have an impact. She had the power to make a difference right here, right now. As the weeks turned into months, Tanya found herself carrying the lessons she had learned that day in court with her, not just in her work, but in how she navigated the world around her. The quiet reflections that followed the speeding ticket incident had sparked a deeper shift in her. She had always prided herself on her resilience and her ability to overcome obstacles, but she now saw that life wasn't just about conquering the big challenges. It was about finding meaning in every experience, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed at the time. Her return to space came faster than she expected. A new mission had been scheduled, and Tanya found herself preparing to leave Earth once again. This time, however, there was something different about the way she approached it. She wasn't just going up there to complete a mission or push the boundaries of human exploration. She was going to space to remind herself of why she had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about the accolades or the glory, it was about the connection to something greater, something beyond herself. As she stood in the preparation room, gearing up for the mission, Tanya thought back to the lessons she had learned in the courtroom. She remembered the judge's acknowledgement of her accomplishments and how it had caused her to reflect on the humanity of the experience. She wasn't just the astronaut who had spent months orbiting the Earth. She was a person, and that person had to live with the choices she made, whether they were about speeding tickets or international space missions. As the countdown began, Tanya's thoughts were clear. She didn't feel the usual adrenaline rush of anticipation. Instead, there was a calmness, a quiet understanding of what it meant to be truly present in both the extraordinary and the everyday. As the rocket engines roared to life and the spacecraft ascended into the sky, Tanya gazed out of the window, watching as the Earth shrank below her, fading into the distance. But even as she soared above the clouds, she felt grounded, more connected to the world she had left behind than she ever had before. Space was still awe-inspiring, still a realm of infinite possibilities, but it no longer held the same sense of detachment it once did. The stars and planets were no longer just symbols of human achievement. They were part of a much bigger story, a story that didn't just begin with space exploration, but with the people on Earth who made it possible. Up there, in the stillness of space, Tanya realized that her role wasn't defined by the fame of being an astronaut, nor by the responsibilities she carried as a representative of human progress. Her role was simply to be a part of something larger, a part of a world that was both extraordinary and ordinary. The two existed together, intertwined. It was the ordinary moments that made the extraordinary possible. Upon returning to Earth, Tanya received a hero's welcome, as she always did. But this time, there was no overwhelming sense of pride or a need to prove herself. She smiled as she was greeted by her colleagues, but inside, she knew that the real victory wasn't in the accolades or the public applause. It was in how she had come to see herself, how she had learned to balance the extraordinary and the ordinary, and how she had embraced both parts of herself. Weeks later, Tanya received a letter from the same judge who had presided over her case. He had written to express his gratitude for the grace she had shown during the court proceedings and how her humility had left a lasting impact on him. He had also shared that his own perspective on what truly mattered in life had shifted because of their conversation. Tanya couldn't help but smile when she read his words. In some small way, her experience had made a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of others. As she walked away from the courthouse for the final time, Tanya felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. She wasn't just an astronaut. She wasn't just the woman who had made headlines or achieved incredible things. She was Tanya Bell, a woman who had learned to navigate the complexities of life with grace, humility, and a deep appreciation for both the extraordinary and the ordinary moments that made life worth living. In the end, Tanya realized that the greatest journey of all wasn't the one that took her to the stars. It was the one that allowed her to fully embrace who she was on Earth and beyond.